Hello, my name is Mikey Mlakar, and my analyzation and critique of an existing SIA was on the proposed rural water system for the White Mountain Apache tribe in Arizona. So to start, I'll go over some of the topics that will be covered in this presentation, including a project introduction, a summary of the proposed action, an analysis and critique of the processes that were utilized, and also an analysis and critique of the impacts that were found through these processes, along with some closing remarks. So under the direction and lead of the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, the text lays out a plan for both the construction and temporary operation of a water system for the residents of the White River community in Arizona. The system will work to divert, store, and distribute water from one portion of the river and deliver it to the area in which White River and the Apache tribe community members are located. The Apache people are considered to be in a vulnerable position due to both their location within Arizona, along with the existing conditions provided by the landscape. The proposed project would take place directly on the reservation, which can be found in the east central region of the state, as shown in the picture on the right. Currently, residents of the communities in White River rely on a combination of central water systems and public water systems. However, both of these systems are outdated and will lose the capacity to perform adequately as the population on the reservation continues to grow as anticipated. Per the White Mountain Apache Tribe Water Rights Quantification Agreement, the U.S. Congress deployed the Bureau of Reclamation in the planning, designing, and constructing of the rural water system. Thus, the project is to be funded by the federal government and overseen by a series of related agencies. With the Bureau of Reclamation at the lead, additional departments credited in the draft include the White Mountain Apache Tribe, the U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the consulting firm known as Leidos. Each of these departments were tasked with a different aspect in the development of this draft EIS and will continue to serve in these roles until the proposal is made final. As of July 2022, the draft compiled by said groups was just under 700 pages, split into 5 separate chapters. Additionally, 8 appendices regarding specific details surrounding the project and its proposal are included at the end of the report. So following the agreement made between the White Mountain Apache Tribe and U.S. government in 2010, project scoping began and continued up until 2021. Since the EIS for this project is still under review, there is yet to be an official timeline or budget release for the work that would be required. To aid in the understanding of the potential impacts of constructing the water system, an estimated 36 to 48 months are expected in developing the physical aspects of the project, as these are shown in the graphic below. As was mentioned previously, the scale of the system will work to serve the entirety of the population on the White Mountain Apache Tribe Reservation. According to the EIS, there are approximately 15,000 residents across the 1.5 million acres within the reservation's boundaries. For this reason, it is especially important a comprehensive understanding of the potential impacts in this case are identified and communicated. As will be further examined throughout, the methods utilized by practitioners in this case were standard according to those set by the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. Prior to the completion of this draft, input was solicited from groups that had the potential to be affected by the action set out in this proposal. The general public then aided in the identification of environmental issues that would need to be addressed within the EIS. While the draft had been successfully submitted, a final recommendation cannot be made by the Bureau of Reclamation until the report has been approved. It is understood now that the recommendation will be formed utilizing the knowledge gathered during the scoping process and the findings of the EIS. The White Mountain Apache Tribe Rural Water System Draft EIS was made possible by the involvement of an assortment of both public and private entities with varying levels of qualifications for the roles that were served. As was aforementioned, the following agencies were credited for their contribution in preparing the report, as they are shown to the right on this slide. Undoubtedly, the most qualified individuals in understanding the impacts that have the potential to occur are those within the White Mountain Apache Tribe, being that these members both reside on the site of the project as well as being the intended population to benefit. They have an understanding that can only be gained through their experience on the reservation. Moreover, the federal funding utilized in this project, as well as being managed by a governmental office, has granted a series of vetted employees that are considered to be qualified. The only contributor that was questionable was that of Leidos, a private technology and engineering firm that was responsible for consulting services. This particular agency had a significant degree of influence on the data that was compiled and examined throughout the statement. Upon additional research, the mission and qualifications of the company appeared to align with the goals of the study. Thus, the overall qualifications of the persons that were involved in performing this EIS can be considered acceptable. The data collection that was employed by practitioners in this case worked to reveal the existing conditions of the site, as well as gauge the impacts that are likely to affect the surrounding environment. For the details laid out within the EIS, routine collection and interpretation of data was utilized in gathering samples as the draft was developed. Members of each contributing department were responsible for some degree of data collection as it related to their agency. This included field site visits in which samples were taken that would aid in understanding variables in regional context, resource supply, and species population that have the potential to occur given the proposed action. These variables that are identified and studied in the EIS are not only sufficient, but necessary in understanding the impacts of this project. The preparers then worked to develop a system for characterizing the data that was collected that is considered standard under NEPA regulations and will allow impacts to be analyzed. Findings in this case were designated into the following 7 categories as they relate to the impacts that are anticipated: negligible, no observable change, minor or minimal, small but detectable change, moderate, easily measurable change, major, large, observable change, beneficial, adverse, short-term, and long-term. The establishment of these methods prior to breaking ground on the construction and implementation of the project allows for progress to continue even after these stages have been initiated. The comparative analysis that was utilized in the development of this assessment worked primarily to predict and estimate the potential impacts. More specifically, these processes laid out the alternative actions that can be taken for the rural water system and how this will affect the White Mountain Apache tribe community. Being that the rural water system has to be constructed under the details of the water rights quantification agreement, it is not a question of whether or not the project will occur, but rather to what direction the project will take when executed. Each of the NEPA action alternatives that were incorporated in the EIS proposed some scenario in which the rural water system is constructed, with the exception of the no action alternative, as this is used less as a genuine option and more for an understanding of the detrimental effects in not providing the White Mountain Apache tribe with a reliable source of water. 3 additional action alternatives were examined within this draft of the study with varying levels of modification to each of the suggested actions. The adjustments that are observed under each action alternative in the EIS include particular project components, such as the location and performance of the proposed dam, in-stream storage reservoir, intake and diversion structures, pumping plant, treatment facilities, and distribution system. In comprehending how each of the modifications will alter the impacts experienced, contributors for the EIS referenced published literature so as to develop an accurate report. A series of existing engineering design studies were reviewed by authors when forming the action alternatives and the associated impacts. Given these efforts by those responsible in generating the EIS, it appears the comparative analysis that was completed is adequate. The standards and directives of NEPA's policies regarding public participation, which were utilized in developing this EIS, require that a scoping process take place prior to the submission of the draft. Thus, a sequence of initial scoping and identification measures were employed and presented in the report. As stated in the scoping summary appendix of the EIS, tribal members and other groups, agencies, or organizations that could be interested or affected by the proposed White Mountain Apache tribe rural water system were identified and notified of the Bureau of Reclamation's intent to prepare an EIS and the scoping process. Practitioners that contributed to this aspect of the study engaged with a variety of methods in reaching out to the public and particularly affected parties, all of which were in accordance with federal regulations. Types of outreach that were utilized in this case include notices of intent, notification letters, press releases, newspaper advertisements, public service announcement, website postings, and public scoping meetings. The result of this attempt at involving the public was successful, as there was a series of critiques that could be both expressed and addressed prior to the submission of the draft EIS. Additionally, the authors created a section within the appendix of the scoping process that was specific to White Mountain Apache tribe input and, more importantly, the concerns they had surrounding the project. The added attention that was given to the local residents that are most likely to be affected by the proposed action was vital in protecting these vulnerable individuals. Based on the quality and quantity of the responses that were received given these efforts, the public participation in this case can be considered sufficient and appropriate. So luckily with these efforts, there were a series of potential effects that would occur given the introduction of the water system. So the social impacts that are both predicted and uncovered are summarized in the third chapter of the draft, the longest and most in-depth of the sections included in the study. Those who contributed in developing the EIS worked to assess both the direct and indirect effects that are expected to occur, as well as the cumulative impacts. However, the authors do acknowledge that this evaluation may be incomplete due to the unavailability of certain aspects of the plan, such as the final engineering design. From the information that was obtained at the point in the timeline of the project, the following resources were identified with the potential of being affected by the introduction of the rural water system. So, as was mentioned before, this list right here is the impacts that were studied within the EIS. While there is still a measurable amount of information that needs to be assessed, the authors were able to create a range of impact scenarios under the implementation of each prospective action alternative for the current draft. Additional subsections of impacts were identified throughout the study with specific appendices dedicated to assessing the potential impacts to be experienced for each. Particular resources that were emphasized in the evaluation and impact scenarios were those related to water and hydrology, geology and soils, and biological resources. Considering the nature of this project and what is being proposed, the level of emphasis that was employed for these resources come across as both applicable and necessary. The mitigation strategies offered by the contributors of this EIS can be found contained within a separate appendix to the draft titled Additional Project Details, Best Management Practices, and Mitigation Measures. Thus, there were intentional and deliberate efforts made to provide recommendations for how this project can be managed so as to be the least impactful towards its surroundings as possible. The mitigation strategies that are suggested relate directly to the impacts that were mentioned previously, with a select few being examined in this case. These topics that were provided suggest mitigation measures include biological resources, cultural resources, and transportation. The authors then went on to provide more specific details of actions that can be taken under each of the potentially impacted resources, with biological resources receiving the most in-depth list of mitigation measures. While practitioners successfully recognize the number of strategies that will aid in a less impactful project, it does seem this portion of the study could use additional attention. There was a considerable number of impacts that were identified previously in the statement, yet only 3 of these topics were included in identifying measures to be taken against mitigating their effects. The mitigation strategies offered in this draft of the report are reasonable. However, this section of the EIS can certainly be improved in the versions that are inevitably going to follow. And the monitoring strategies that were explored within the scope of the study were also found in the aforementioned appendix to the draft under the section titled Best Management Practices / Minimization Measures. Once again, contributors selected particular resource topics in the recommendations that were provided for monitoring the project and its impacts. While practitioners still failed to produce a complete list of monitoring strategies according to the impacts that were identified, this investigation into how the project should be monitored moving forward was undoubtedly more thorough. Strategies were provided for several more resource topics than what was covered in the text regarding mitigation measures. And moreover, practitioners went a step further in providing these strategies by including when in the project's timeline would be most ideal in acting on said measures, i.e. before construction, during forest clearing, in the event of soil contamination, and during operations of the water system. Overall, the monitoring strategies that were prepared in this draft of the EIS appeared to be fairly inclusive, and given their use would likely be an effective tool in tracking the impacts experienced as a result of the rural water system. So upon completing the analysis and critique for both the processes employed and the impacts identified within this report, it appears the report fully met all but one of the 6 principles for social impact assessment. The only principle that does not seem to have been fulfilled to the extent of a finalized and approved EIS is that of Principle 6, to undertake project, program, or policy monitoring and evaluation and propose mitigation measures if needed. While there were certainly efforts made, as was recognized previously, this aspect of the statement has room to be improved in the versions that are to follow. For this reason, among the others discussed in this analysis and critique, I would give this report an A- letter grade. I base this score on the degree to which the EIS fulfilled the guiding principles for social impact assessment in the U.S., as these standards that have been expertly formed and provide for the best practices in this field of work. Considering most of the principles were met almost perfectly in this draft of the statement, I would consider this to be a successful instance of assessing the potential impacts of a proposed action. Thank you.